All right, our next presentation will be from Clinton Johnson of Esri, helping state and local governments use GIS to create a more racially equitable future. I'll turn this over to Clinton here as I read his bio. Clinton Johnson helps organizations create geospatial strategies for equitable outcomes. He takes an empathetic approach to technology that begins with understanding real-world challenges faced by diverse communities and finding creative ways to implement practical solutions. Clinton also founded and leads North Star, an employee community focused on increasing representation, inclusion, and belonging for people of African descent in GIS. He's also an advocate for belonging equity for people from underrepresented groups in GIS and STEM more broadly. I'll turn it over to you now, Clinton. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan. So, as he said, I'm Clinton Johnson. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm excited to be here today and engage in this important subject, using GIS to create more racially equitable futures for your jurisdictions. The reality is race and place matter. Societies and its systems project racial identities onto people and all too often apply different rules and create different circumstances for people based upon these racial identities. And we call that racial inequity. And racial inequities affect and are affected by where you live, work, play, and get educated. And people all around the world are just trying to live healthy and successful lives. Communities are trying to make the best of their local resources. Families are trying to provide strong foundations for prosperity and health for their children. And kids are just trying to live and grow up. And yet, far too many are plagued by a wide range of inequities across a broad spectrum of topics. Some communities are dealing with underfunded schools and over-policing. Some families are dealing with intergenerational economic hardships and underemployment. And far too many children are growing up with limited access to technology, yet overexposure to toxins. And many individuals, communities, and organizations are working to understand and unravel those inequities. In fact, many cities, counties, and some states have even declared racism as a public health crisis. Many organizations are stepping up to do their part, recognizing that racial injustice is everyone's problem to address. And most are committed to driving that change through cross-sector partnerships. And at the federal level in the US, racial equity is a key priority. In many ways, it's at the forefront of executive actions. And it cuts across all of the other top priorities. In fact, there's an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. And this is applied throughout federal government, calling for all agencies to identify methods to assess equity, which requires an intersectional equity lens that includes geography. The executive order also calls for each agency to conduct equity assessments. It calls for the allocation of resources to advance fairness and opportunity. It calls for the promotion of equitable delivery of benefits and opportunities for all constituents, and for increased engagement with members of underserved communities, and the establishment of an equitable data working group. Recognizing the need to disaggregate by race, ethnicity, gender, disability, income, veteran status, and so many other demographic factors. And Esri is standing by our commitment to work with all of you to leverage the power of geographic and holistic thinking to increase understanding and create solutions that ultimately help bring an end to these long-standing injustices. So I want to be clear about some of these key terms because this stuff can be kind of confusing at times. So let's start with identity. Social identity in particular relates to how people are identified in relation to others based upon multiple intersecting social characteristics. By how people are identified, this means both how people identify themselves, but also it includes the assumptions that other people and systems make about people's identities. And we're going to focus on racial identities, meaning those social identities that relate to racialized characteristics like race, ethnicity, religion, language, country of origin, and so many other factors. And location is an important social characteristic as well, meaning where people live, work, play, and grow up. It's just another way that people identify themselves. So when we think about racial identities, we should think more complexly than Black and white, but to be more nuanced and think about things like African American boys in low-income communities in Philadelphia, Latinas in their 20s living in communities in Texas, or white men in their early 30s living in Florida. All of these are complex intersectional racial identities. We'll also talk about disparities. A disparity being a noticeable and unusually significant difference. Social disparities in the framework that you'll see today are disparities in community conditions or outcomes between people of different social identities. And a racial disparity is a significant difference between people of different racial identities. Some examples broadly include pay gaps, like the pay gap between men and women more generally, and Black women, Latinas, and Asian men, to be more specific, wealth gaps, like the wealth gap between Black and white families and Asian families in the country. Disparities in educational outcomes, like disparities in school attrition, postgraduate degrees, and disparities in air quality or exposure to toxins. And inequities are disparities that are the result of injustices, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit later, what injustices mean in a sense. And disparities effectively place a higher degree of burden on one group relative to others, like how disparities in COVID-19 health outcomes place a higher burden on Black and Latinx families than on other families. So racial equity is so important. And there are generally three answers to the question, what is racial equity? Racial equity is a condition, one that is met when policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages no longer produce racial inequities. Racial equity is also a process. It's the actual work that's done to address racial inequities or to advance racial equity. And both the condition and the process require analysis, meaning some assessment or root cause analysis of racial equities or of racial equity. And the overall idea is to achieve the condition of racial equity by doing the process or the work of racial equity, all of which is informed by or validated by racial equity analysis, with the goal ultimately being to ensure that everyone thrives regardless of any perceived racial identity. And generally, we refer to the analysis or the execution of the process of racial equity as applying a racial equity lens. To effectively assess equity, organizations are trying to apply intersectional racial equity lenses to examine and address disparities. And the intersections included in these lenses often, of course, begin with race, ethnicity, and caste, but they also include religion, language, country of origin, nationality, immigration status. Moreover, those factors intersect with other social characteristics, including gender, sexual orientation, age, and ability, as well as with characteristics that speak to the concept of class, like income, home ownership, and more. All of which either impact or are impacted by where people live, work, and play. Meaning, very often, where people live is a consequence of racial disparities that individuals or their families have experienced over time. And at the same time, the conditions within which a person lives can also be affected by these racial disparities. So racial equity work is rarely about race alone or gender alone. Racialized identities consist of all of these factors and more. So an organization trying to identify and address racial disparities in, let's say, asthma-related hospitalizations in a community might look something like exploring population groups like Black girls between 6 and 10 living in median income communities, Latinas in their 20s living in high income communities, or white men in their early 30s living in low income communities. And equity analysis would then compare the proportion of hospitalizations by racial identity to the proportion of each of those population groups in a given city, state, or other geography. So here is, in this fictitious example, we see that while Black girls between 6 and 10 represent only 5% of the population, they account for 25% of hospitalization. So there's a disparity of 20%. We also see that while Latinas in their 20s only represent 5% of the populations as well, they account for 15% of hospitalizations, a disparity of 10%, while white men in their 30s represent 35% of the population, but only 20% of the hospitalization. So another disparity of 15% in the other direction. And GIS provides resources and guidance to help folks apply an intersectional racial equity lens to assess overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination like racism, anti-Semitism, tribalism, classism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia, and so on. In fact, GIS offers access to a lot of spatial data to help organizations explore, understand, and confront these issues. Like how the W.K. Kellogg Foundation used spatial data to assess access to healthcare for Black women and their babies in New Orleans. And how Territorial Empathy in New York used maps, animation, and audio to show the impact of COVID-19 on communities over time, and highlighted the devastating, disproportionate impacts of the disease on communities of color, with Black and Latinx or Hispanic families most significantly impacted. It's also important to recognize that inequities are intrinsically and structurally related, and as such, create a wide range of experiences and outcomes and community conditions for people living across different geographies. And very often we find ourselves just focusing on the outcomes when we think of inequities. We focus on issues like disparities in chronic health conditions, infant mortality rates and birth outcomes, employment status and educational attainment. Yet, racial equity best practices recognize that there's a relationship between disparities in outcomes and the disparities in community assets and conditions that contribute to those outcomes. And root cause analysis best practices go further to recognize that inequities in outcomes and inequities in community conditions and assets all flow from decisions and practices further upstream. And the goal is not just to assess and address unhealthy streams, but also to uplift, identify, and amplify decisions and practices that lead to community assets that drive positive outcomes. And this model was heavily influenced by work done by King County, Washington, as well as by the nonprofit organization Race Forward. And in this model, outcomes are the indicators of how people fare. That is to say how individuals, families, and communities fare socially and economically. Outcomes include results like educational attainment and school attrition, prevalence and severity of chronic disease, and many other social and economic results. Community assets and conditions are the circumstances surrounding individuals, families, and communities where they live, where they work, and where they take their leisure. Community conditions and assets include circumstances like access to quality health care, to education, to parks, to recreation, housing and environmental conditions, whether good or bad, and many other conditions across a wide range of concerns. And decisions and practices are the policies, programs, systems, and budget decisions that influence the circumstances surrounding individuals, families, and communities, ultimately impacting how they fare. And these include historic and contemporary practices and decisions by governments, businesses, and communities themselves. Decisions and practices may create or sustain structural racism or other forms of discrimination, biased against or for people based on class, gender, or other social groupings, inequitable distributions of resources or power, or intergenerational inequities, meaning any combination of the above impacting multiple generations of families or communities over time. So when we talk about inequities, we're talking about disparities that are the result of, as I said before, injustices. And these are those kinds of injustices that can occur. This model helps us to understand and address the root causes of social inequities, including racial injustice. For instance, let's look at this study in Charlotte, North Carolina by the Clean Air Carolina organization. This study highlights a priority area surrounding the center of Charlotte. Residents in this area tend to have higher rates of negative health outcomes, and that includes things like higher rates of behavioral health risks like smoking and obesity, chronic conditions like high blood pressure and diabetes, and most sadly, higher rates of death. There also appear to be disparities in several community conditions, including exposures to toxins. For instance, the historic West End, a predominantly Black community, has disproportionately higher concentrations of factories, waste sites, truck stops, and other large emitters of harmful air pollution. As we look further upstream to decisions and practices, we find that Charlotte has a history of segregation, it has a history of redlining, and the people in the historic West End live with a long-standing legacy of industrial zoning and highway construction, where time and time again, large sources of air pollution were cited in or near this community, which had less wealth and less political power. This high concentration of nearby air pollution um, further reduces property values, locking residents into homes that they can't afford to sell. And redlining as a practice represents one of the most damaging instances of systemic racial discrimination or injustice that the country has recorded since the history of slavery. Again, while this can help identify unhealthy streams, this methodology can also help inform and design healthy streams. So by focusing on practices that drive down racist outcomes, that advance equity through decisions, and by equitably distributing power and resources and doing things to remediate and heal intergenerational inequities, systems can result in community assets to create the kinds of outcomes that we really want to see. And GIS provides a wide and growing array of techniques and tools to help organizations understand and unravel interrelated concerns, address barriers to equality, and design a future where all communities are served equitably. So last summer, Esri began providing guidance and resources to help all of you map and understand racial inequity, providing a racial equity hub that includes examples of how other organizations have used GIS to advance racial equity, and by curating and sharing relevant data to help you visualize and analyze inequities in your jurisdictions. And over time, we've evolved this guidance to help organizations apply GIS as a framework for racial equity. This is a collection of guidance and capabilities to essentially help organizations advance racial justice. And that begins with guidance for applying a racial equity lens. So I've already really talked about what a racial equity lens looks like. And we all understand that race and place matters. So as I said before, Esri provides data, tools, and guidance to help folks apply an equity lens. And that, of course, includes Esri's maps for public policy and the Living Atlas, as well as all of the rich capabilities of of ArcGIS and all of its form that help folks assess and analyze inequity. You can also integrate GIS with best practice workflows for advancing racial equity and social justice. The racial equity workflow is a critical aspect of applying GIS as a framework for racial equity. The workflow is derived from emerging and best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice. We've simply infused these standard methods with best practices for GIS and location intelligence. And organizations working towards racial justice are always either implicitly or explicitly executing this cycle. And of course, the more explicitly they execute the cycle, the more likely they'll have better outcomes. So organizations working towards racial equity need to be informed by, and collaborate with stakeholders inside and outside of the organization. So engaged communities is at the core of this workflow to support your efforts to increase awareness, understanding, and collaboration at every stage of the process. So deploy the racial equity community outreach solution to enable your organization to engage stakeholders around focus initiatives and key metrics. Use surveys and crowdsourcing apps to ground truth your understanding of the needs. And use story maps to share a complete narrative, putting the issues and the solutions in the proper context. Organizations working to advance racial equity are trying to proactively seek out racial injustices, identify clear goals and objectives for measurable outcomes, and all the while engaging the community in the process. So the first stage in the workflow is map and analyze inequities, meaning helping you to apply a racial equity lens to reveal and understand inequity, to locate populations of concern, to identify community assets to generate more positive outcomes, and identify barriers to equality. So at this stage, you can use Esri's Living Atlas to find data resources to enrich your own. You can use community analysts and business analysts to produce infographics to help you explore your communities. You can find training resources in the Racial Equity Hub to help you get started, taking on some of the relatively foundational tasks, or to take on more challenging scenarios. And work with tools you may already have, like Urban, to assess equity in your jurisdictions. With an understanding of where inequities are impacting populations of concern, organizations then seek to infuse their efforts with racial equity and social justice best practices, meaning ensuring that their programs and services are distributed equitably, as well as delivering interventions and doing policy work to create real change. So the operationalized best practice stage is where organizations seek to design and plan equitable allocations of resources, alleviating burdens on communities of color. In this stage, users find ways to use maps, apps, and spatial analysis for collecting the right information, the right location, demographic, and operational data to enhance the delivery of services. So we encourage users to leverage ArcGIS and all of its flavors to identify more equitable resource allocations, automate the work, including the work of your teams on the ground, inform decisions using the right configurations of our products, data, training, and services, and embed equity directly into your existing workflows. Finally, organizations need to ensure that their efforts to increase equity are having the impact they seek. So in the managed performance stage, organizations use decision-making tools to visualize inequities at a glance, to adapt strategies and operations dynamically. So use maps and dashboards to assess your impact and identify opportunities for increased equity. Compare your workforce, your volunteers, the folks receiving your services with the community at large to ensure equitable delivery. Go beyond race and look at population groups in a nuanced way to more effectively assess and support the most vulnerable. And apply the same concept to explore amenities, conditions, and outcomes in your communities. Of course, some organizations may find themselves in the middle of operationalizing best practices or managing performance at this very moment. And organizations will undoubtedly need to repeat this cycle periodically, perhaps around a new initiative, just revamping a program or service, as you're updating your strategic plans. Just know that you can jump into this cycle wherever you are and just keep moving through it to maximize your impact. And to support your efforts to automate your practices, you can also leverage product and solution configuration guidance. We recognize that leaders in organizations across the globe are challenged with addressing racial equity in the work that's happening across the enterprise. They need tools and resources at their fingertips to inform decisions and actions to ensure that their work is creating the benefits that they hope for marginalized communities and not burdens. So we're delivering solutions that align with your organizational workflows, as well as providing product configuration guidance to help GIS teams deliver the right maps and apps to the right leaders at the right time. The racial equity community outreach solution, for instance, provides a destination for racial equity, focusing on initiatives and metrics and enabling organizations to collect community sentiment to understand disparities in constituents' experiences with their services. It enables folks to monitor workforce diversity as your organization strive for more equitable representation. And it empowers folks to apply an intersectional racial equity lens to address inequities based on combinations of race, gender, and years of service in their efforts to create a more diverse workforce. And there's a police transparency solution that we provide that enables organizations to promote their agency's work to advance equity, build stronger engagement by connecting constituents to the officers that serve them, enabling folks to highlight their progress towards increased diversity with some specific focus on how police forces tend to be structured, and to share information about use of force and so much more information. And finally, there's a process for enterprise-wide racial equity initiatives. We understand that many leaders in state and local government, including a growing list of racial equity leads, are working to organize and oversee racial equity initiatives and drive impact across the enterprise. So we're making available resources to facilitate the understanding of priorities, the understanding of impact, and assessing the scope of enterprise-wide initiatives in a structured manner based on emerging and best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice in order to help folks create geospatial strategies that help leaders orchestrate the delivery of GIS capabilities that drive the racial equity initiatives that you need to throughout your communities and throughout your organization. As you can see, Esri provides comprehensive GIS and location intelligence resources to support a broad range of racial equity and social justice initiatives. In many ways, these resources simply reflect the emerging and best practices for advancing racial equity and social justice that leaders working in and around your organizations have been executing and evolving for years. And we intend to continue to evolve this guidance and our capabilities as your needs and your efforts to address racial equity evolve. So if you're looking to get started, visit the racial equity website at www.esri.com/racial-equity. There you'll find a section specifically focused on government with lots of resources to help you map and analyze inequities, execute the workflow. You'll also find a broad array of resources, including links directly to information about the racial equity community outreach solution and the police transparency solution. Pretty soon we'll have a business inclusion solution coming up to help organizations understand the needs of a diverse community of business owners so that it can better inform their efforts to provide programming and services to support the development and the sustainment of BIPOC and women-owned businesses. There's also a racial equity GIS hub that I mentioned, where you can find lots of resources, data, maps, dashboards, examples from other customers, lots of training resources, information about relevant events that are coming up. And definitely check out our data sources. So I figure I'll stop there.